Hello. We are pleased to welcome you again to our C.S. Lewis and Kindred Spirits event, organized by the C.S. Lewis and Kindred Spirits Society, powered by the Agora Christi Foundation and the Alexandru Ioan Cuza University of Iași. It's wonderful to see your faces and all the names of friends from all over the world on the screen. And it is an amazing thing that we can meet like this. And I thank you for being here. We are going to hear today about C.S. Lewis and Dorothy Sayers, two reluctant prophets. And I'm delighted that Sayers, who was an amazing writer, is not very much known comparing to C.S. Lewis. And it is wonderful to have a Dorothy Sayers scholar to do some justice regarding this. So our special guests are David and Crystal Downing. They are the Marian Wade Center co-directors. And I can confess that I greatly admire and love them. And I'm grateful for the wonderful way they always received me and helped me at this Wade Center. Thank you for being here. I'm also greeting my dear friend, Dr. Kirstin J. Johnson, George MacDonald Scholar, who is, as always, our host. And she will introduce our guests and she will conduct the whole conversation. Later on, Dr. Brenton Dixon will join us and lead us in our fellowship time, connecting time that follows after we will be hearing our guests. So, Kirstin, please introduce our...
Thank you, Denise. And Denise, you know what? I'm going to pull rank. And before I introduce our marvelous guests, could you just, I'm going to do this at the beginning and the end so we make sure everyone hears this. Could you tell us a little bit about what's happening in Iași this November?
Oh, well, we are preparing for the new C.S. Lewis and conference, which is the 6th. You can see it here. C.S. Lewis, the Reenchanted Academic. We have already around 40 speakers that have registered, and we have just launched the second call for papers. We are very glad that we can bring scholars from all over the world, but especially from Central and Eastern Europe. And many of them got connected, and we hope to have a great time.
Thank you. And that's in November, specifically which days?
9 to 11. And okay. I reinforce that it is held in the University of Iași, and it is an interdisciplinary conference, meaning we bring together at the same table literature, philosophy, history, arts, and theology, and even law today, because we are going to have a scholar from Oxford who is a lawyer.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I hope to see you all there.
Yes, we can't wait.
As
we gladly invite you all. We gladly invite you all.
Yeah, everybody. It is a marvelous time, and usually once you've gone once, it becomes a little hard not to return to the beautiful city and the beautiful people and the just fantastic dialogue. Now, as we turn to our thoughts to today, I'm going to remind you of the typical format, and there you can see the poster on the page, which is fantastic for the conference in November. I'm going to be introducing you all to the marvelous David and Crystal Downing, and we're going to be learning more about who they are and what attracted them to Lewis and Sayers through questions, and we're going to delve more into Lewis and Sayers themselves. Along the way, we'll get there. We're going to parse out this title a little bit more as part of that dialogue, and undoubtedly you will have questions throughout, not just at the end. Feel free to chat in the chat space thingamabobby there with each other. And if Crystal or David or I reference a certain book or website or article, something like that, I know we have in the audience a lot of people who are great at throwing those specific links right into the chat. So if I could ask you guys, just keep an eye on that. And if you ID a chat or idea an author or a book, throw that up there for us. That would be really helpful. And feel free to throw questions in the chat. We have a whole cornucopia of Inkling scholars here today and Inkling students. And so some people love to chat and sort of add further comments here and there. As those of you who've been here before know, I am lousy at reading the chat while engaging with people online. I'm going to be present to David and Crystal. I won't be present to what's going on the side, which means if you have questions that you would like David and Crystal to address, can you please DM those messages to Agora Christie? So specifically send those questions to Agora Christie. They will funnel them on to me, and that way your questions won't get lost. I'll warn you now, I'm sure there will be so many questions, we will not be able to answer them all. We will have time at the end for questions. However, when our session is over and we set the Downings free to recover from engaging with us for so long, Brenton Dickinson, as Denise has mentioned, will come on and be our favorite after chat host. And that'll be a chance to hang out, say hi to people that you haven't seen, to delve further into some of those questions, to share some thoughts on some of those ideas. So if you have the time and would love to hang out for that afterwards, please do. But for now, on to the Downings. I gotta start this in a strange way. This past weekend, I was hosting an event with the Canadian hip hop artist Shad. His most recent album, this is a Canadian hip hop artist, his most recent album, Tao, is in part a response to the resonances between C.S. Lewis's 1940s book, Abolition of Man, and a recent publication called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Zuboff. And the questions, his album is a response or engaging with the questions that both authors ask across the decades about what it means to be human. It's an album that's just come out now and is doing really well on the hip hop scene, on all sorts of different music scenes in Canada and globally. At the same conference, I had fun conversations with attendees in their 20s and 30s who had studied Dorothy Sayers on pedagogy, but were only now discovering the delights of her detectives, Peter Wimsey and Harriet Vane. They were completely surprised to discover that Sayers was also a playwright. They had no idea she was a Dante scholar, let alone that she wrote about the imagination and the Trinity. Both Sayers and Lewis continued to weave their way into the weekend here in surprising and fun ways. It was not an Inklings conference at all. And yet this interweaving reminds us that the voices of Sayers and Lewis remain relevant across not only the decades, but across cultures and denominations. Perhaps not only in some ways prophetic then, but perhaps still so today. So the hip hop artist Shad would argue. I'm not going to put any more time into describing those two colorful scholars, our two colorful scholars, Sayers and Lewis, as today we are graced with the presence of two other delightful scholar authors who have each spent many years and poured much of their very selves into doing so. Crystal and David Downing are both award-winning scholars for their work. They are both prolific writers who have hit bestseller lists. Crystal most recently for her book Subversive, Christ Culture and the Shocking Dorothy L. Sayers. And David, I don't have a visual of your book, though. I have a visual of this book that people often say is the best book on the Cosmic Trilogy. So if you're looking for that, there you go. But David's most recent book has appeared just recently on the New York Times bestseller list this spring, for his book, C.S. Lewis on Writers and Writing. Get that down right. And both David and Crystal are very engaging speakers, as I know some of you are well aware. Now, you may have gathered that Crystal and David are married. And not only that, after years of teaching at various institutions, they are now workplace colleagues, co-directors of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Illinois in the United States. As usual, I want to draw us into a better understanding both of our topic and of the folk who are generously here to help us learn more, and to invite us all to think more deeply through a series of questions. But I think I'd like to start with having Crystal and David introduce their workplace to us. It's a key operative in the growth and development of inkling studies around the globe of all the 7 Wade authors, which some people might not categorize as inklings. And even as I utter the word inkling, I'm aware that not everyone here will even be familiar with that word. David, Crystal, some of us throw around the phrase the Wade, like it was in the OED or something. Both my parents went to Wheaton in the age of Kilby, no less. It was easy for me to forget that the word may mean little to other people. So with a huge thanks to you being here, and a huge thanks to the myriad of ways, known and unknown, that many folk at the Wade over the years have enriched all of our lives. Even the foundations of the C.S. Lewis connected events are rooted in generosity of the Wade people. What is the Wade? And why are you both now there together, no less?
Well, we are both at the Wade because it's clear to us this is where God wanted us. We weren't thinking of changing our positions. Both of us were senior distinguished professors, and we had no intention of leaving our colleges in Pennsylvania, but God made the way clear for us. And it's delightful for us to be there because since David is a C.S. Lewis scholar, I'm a Sayers scholar, this center was begun. And Kirstin, you mentioned Clyde Kilby that your parents had as a professor. He is the person who started the C.S. Lewis collection at Wheaton College. And he, in the early 1960s, maybe even 65. Yeah, he started it then, but before that, he realized, hey, this C.S. Lewis guy, I think he's going to be famous someday. And he started writing C.S. Lewis in England. And when Lewis died in 63, he kept writing Lewis's brother. And then he would keep all those letters, and he would then buy more letters. And then he decided, wow, I should start collecting materials by and about people who influenced Lewis. And hence the 6 other authors that we archive at the Wade. And we have 2,500 books that were owned by C.S. Lewis that have, many of which have his annotations. So you can really discover what C.S. Lewis thought by reading his annotations. There's, of course, when you're publishing a response to someone, and Abolition of Man was a published response, but when you're making annotations in a book, you can say your real feelings. And one of the books that we have at the Wade, C.S. Lewis wrote in the margin about the author, "This man is a fool." So you can come to the Wade to discover what C.S. Lewis really thought about this particular author. And the Wade is also the preeminent has the most comprehensive collection in the world of Dorothy Sayers materials, published and unpublished, which is great for me. Do you want to add anything, David?
Well, I was just going to say the influencers, some of them are inklings, this group that met once or twice a week in Oxford. So that includes Lewis, his brother Warren, J.R.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, Owen Barfield came and joined when he could. And so it includes the inklings, this literary gathering in Oxford, as well as authors like Dorothy Sayers and G.K. Chesterton and Charles Williams. So it's an attempt to round out, and George MacDonald. Yeah, and so it's an attempt to round out Lewis's friends. And yeah, I'm so sorry I left out George MacDonald. Now, we just heard recently, the Wade Center is a separate building on the Wheaton campus here in Illinois. We just heard recently, when you go to heaven and stand before St. Peter, they will ask, have you been to the Wade Center? And if you have not been, you better have a lot of good works to make up for that. That's maybe, no, maybe not. Okay, I'm sorry.
I can say that I'm pretty sure that this is true.
I think you've given us enough to know why the Wade Center is important and what's attractive to being there for you two. In addition to being co-directors, you're also co-chairs in Christian thought at Wheaton. Why not co-chairs in Inkling Studies or in the 7 literature?
Well, that's a good question. There's
A hard
actually
question.
there's a Clyde Kilby chair in the English department, but we are the Marion E. Wade chair. His daughter provided the money for to support the collection and the building. Now, once again, I have a joke where I say we're the co-directors, we're the chair of Christian thought. If you have a Christian thought, you have to check with one of us to make sure it's legitimate. So it's a very powerful position. I think they wanted a general name for it because past chairs have been English professors, a philosophy professor, a history professor. So they wanted a general title for chairs coming in who might have academic expertise in other disciplines besides what you might call Inkling Studies.
Okay. This is my last really heavy question. I've seen this on several bios, particularly the Wade Center bios of you two, which is presumably vetted by yourselves and are what you want the world to see and know. And there's a sentence that says, in her rare leisure time, Crystal enjoys hiking or bicycling through the rural countryside, climbing up waterfalls and exploring distinctive architecture. David, do you not have leisure time? There is nothing in your bio about interest or leisure time.
He enjoys napping in his leisure time.
Yeah, we both like biking and hiking. I could have added that. This is a great area. Illinois is very flat, so we're taking a lot of bike rides around this Chicagoland. I hadn't thought about nothing in my leisure time. Yeah, it's not as interesting as Crystal. It would tend to be watching sports and napping. That would probably be the 2 big ones.
Okay, we'll keep that back there. David, when did you first meet Lewis? Which book? How did you first meet Lewis?
I started with Paralandra. There's an interesting book called Mere Christians, people whose life journey had something to do with reading a Lewis book. And it's very interesting because there's a lot of portals to Lewis. For some people, it's Mere Christianity. For some, it's Narnia. For some, it's the Cosmic Trilogy. I was raised in a very conservative Christian home in Colorado, and I had a lot of questions when I went off to college. I was worried about the problem of suffering. How could a good God allow so much injustice and suffering in the world? I was concerned about contradictions in Scripture. There's one version in which Judas hangs himself. There's another version in which he falls down in a field and his bowels fall out. So I had a lot of questions, and my church leaders were good-hearted, but they weren't very intellectually sophisticated. So they seem to be satisfied with simple answers. When I was in 3rd grade, I was studying the Navajos, and I asked my 3rd grade Sunday school teacher. Now, the Navajos, they were a peaceful tribe. They loved making jewelry. They loved making blankets. They did not go to war with other tribes. But they were physically, the European missionaries couldn't get to the New World by then. So what's happening to the Navajos? I mean, how is God going to judge them? And my 3rd grade Sunday school teacher said, well, God knew who would respond to the gospel and who wouldn't. So he took all the people who wouldn't respond and he put them in North and South America. So that was his solution, which I consider to be rather intellectually ingenious, but not very emotionally satisfying. I went home and asked my dad. He had a better answer. He said, David, the main thing for you is to trust the character of God. If you know he's just and you know he's merciful, you don't have to figure out the logistics of who goes to heaven, who doesn't go to heaven, which was a better answer. But anyway, I went off to college with a lot of questions, and we were reading a fantasy lit course, which included Paralandra. And so my entry to C.S. Lewis was Paralandra. And here was a view of the fall and where does evil come from that was so much more intellectually robust than just saying, well, Eve ate the apple, therefore we're still suffering thousands of years later. And I was shocked that a fantasy story, I'd read Jules Verne, I'd read H.G. Wells, but I was shocked that a fantasy story could have so much theological content. There are places in Paralandra where Eldils, instead of being angels with wings and harps, they're these kind of footsteps of light that are glimmering around you. That shows the presence of Eldils. And I remember one night I was walking home from the library in the moonlight, and as it filtered through the trees, I said, am I surrounded by Eldils right now? Am I surrounded by angels? So for me, the entry was Paralandra. And then I read the other two in the Cosmic Trilogy, went on to Mere Christianity, Problem of Pain. I decided, when I got to Narnia, I read all 7 of them in 2 weeks. And then I was sad they were over, so I reread them all in 2 weeks. So I went from not having read Narnia to having read them twice in a month. So that for me was the entree, was the Ransom trilogy. And I ended up, you held up that book. When I was in grad school, I had a Christian professor and I said, why has no one written a book on the Ransom trilogy? This is serious literature. This isn't just beach reading or airport reading. And he said, well, if you think so, why don't you prove it? Why don't you write a book about it? So I took up his challenge and I wrote a book about the Ransom trilogy. And since then, there's been a lot of scholarship about that. But I was glad that I could be one of the people to be an early voice for the significant literary achievement of the Ransom trilogy, not just kind of throwaway reading or beach reading.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Crystal, how about you and Sayers?
I had never heard of Dorothy Sayers before a friend of mine at the college where David was teaching out in California drew my attention to the fact that this college had absolutely no courses in women's literature. And at the time, I was the alumni director at the college. She was director of public relations. And both of us, she was like 26 and I was 24. I mean, we were just these young things, but that way they didn't have to pay us very much. And this college had a Jan term program where for 3 weeks, students took just one class. And she and I dreamed up this idea of offering a women's literature class for the 3 weeks. And since we were salaried people, we thought, oh, they'll probably say yes if we tell them we'll do it for free because we're already employed by the college. And they did say yes. They probably thought, well, they can't do much harm in 3 weeks. So we taught and we planned a syllabus together. And of course, Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters and George Eliot. Then my friend said, you know, I think we should teach something by Dorothy Sayers. And I go, who's Dorothy Sayers? And she had to explain it to me because I wasn't particularly a detective fiction fan, but she had heard of her. So we included Sayers' very first novel, Whose Body, which was published in 1923. And that's when I learned about her. And then as David was at the same college, he published the book you have held up, Planets in Peril, right? That was published back then. And after I finished my PhD, we were in the situation where how do you find 2 academic jobs in English studies? And so it necessitated for us to go to Pennsylvania, but I see this as another part of God's leading. There are many small liberal arts colleges in Pennsylvania because that is where United States government started, colleges started. So once we were in Pennsylvania rather than California, David said, you know, I've heard of this place called the Wade Center. And evidently it has a bunch of unpublished letters by Lewis and a bunch of books Lewis owned. Let's go out there so I can do research for my next book. And I decided if we're flying out there, and we tend to do everything together because we don't have children, so we're kind of each other's best friends and children, some of us more than others. But I went out to be with David, and I thought, I am going to study the only woman who is collected at the Wade. And I had read that one novel by Dorothy Sayers, and the rest is history. When I started reading her letters and her theological works, I was blown away. This was an amazing woman. And indeed, not long before he died, C.S. Lewis was asked, we know about the people who brought you to faith, but who else guided your spiritual development? And he named 4 people, 2 specialists on mysticism, and that is, I think David's best book is on C.S. Lewis and mysticism, Into the Region of Awe, but then also G.K. Chesterton and Dorothy Sayers. So Sayers was an important influence on Lewis, and I had already fallen in love with Lewis, so I thought, wow, this gives me even more motivation to study Sayers.
Maybe I was going to bounce back to David for a second, and David, I will get back to you with a similar question, but I think that's a nice segue into my next question for you, Crystal, is just basically, who is Dorothy Sayers? Who would you say Sayers is? And I'd really love for you to pull into that, the aspect of Sayers that I have not highlighted yet, and that most people I know they tend to be unaware of this, and that is her role in film and her connection to film. Yeah.
Well,
so who cares, and make sure you pull in the film aspect too.
Okay. That is a complicated question, but Sayers was born 5 years before C.S. Lewis, and she, like Lewis, got first-class honors at Oxford University. She got her honors the exact same year Tolkien did. So I love thinking about Tolkien and Sayers perhaps crossing paths at Oxford. And after part of the trouble is that in 1915, when Sayers got first-class honors, doing the exact same work that males did at Oxford, and surpassing most by getting first-class honors, she wasn't given a degree, because in 1915, it thought, well, women don't need college degrees. After all, they're just going to spend time with children, either by being mothers or teachers. So Sayers bought into that script and got a job as a teacher right after Oxford, and hated it. It wasn't her gift. So she left that job, and interestingly, her job was in the same place where Tolkien moved with his wife. So once again, they might have crossed paths in about 1916. But she went back to Oxford. She loved Oxford. That fed her brain, if didn't reward her abilities, and worked in Blackwood's bookshop. Many of you have probably been to Blackwood's in
Blackwell's.
Blackwell's, excuse me. Blackwell's, thank you, in Oxford. And then got a crush on someone, went to France for a year, and in France, she was helping this crush of hers to run a boarding school. While in France, she started writing screenplays. And this, of course, would have been silent screenplays because sound didn't come in till 1927. But she loved writing screenplays. And while she was at Oxford, she was going to movies and writing home about these great movies she saw. And her tastes correspond with most film scholars. She recognized the really high quality films. And the trouble was, when the collected letters of Sayers were put together, and there's 4 volumes, about 2,000 pages of Sayers collected letters. The person who collected them left out all the letters that had to do with cinema. Now, I understand why, because the person who collected the letters was born in 1915. She was of the generation that thought, oh, movies is just crass entertainment. And she so wanted to prove that Sayers was an intellectual. So she concludes every single letter in which Sayers is figuring out the translation of Dante. And Sayers was brilliant. She, Penguin Books hired her to translate Dante. That was towards the end of her life. But she didn't want people to think that Sayers wasted her time going to movies. So that's great for me, because I have access to all these unpublished letters. And any of you out there, if you want to come to the Wade, we let you look at unpublished manuscripts and correspondence of any of our authors for free. And I have plenty to write about. I was a professor of literature and film in Pennsylvania, so I have film background. I already have published a book on film, so I brought all that knowledge with me, and hence I've signed a contract for my next book called, and some of you will, I think, appreciate this title, The Wages of Cinema, looking through the lens of Dorothy L. Sayers.
Cool. Very, very cool. Okay, we're excited about that. Now, talking about books, David, I'm going to pull into my question, who is C.S. Lewis? I'm going to ask you to pull into that. And aware that lots of people here kind of know who C.S. Lewis is, but there's a lot of stuff people don't know about Lewis. Like even his film, King Kong. Lewis loved King Kong. I remember reading that when I was a grad student going, what? This does not fit into my picture of Narnia at all. But you've even pulled Lewis and Tolkien into into a piece of fiction that you have written. So as you tell us who Lewis is, can you pull that into the description?
Okay. Lewis wasn't a big fan of movies the way Dorothy Sayers was. He thought people went to films because the building was well heated, and a lot of places in Oxford were not well heated. So he claimed that was the main reason people went to movies. But he said that in general, he considered movies to be too noisy and too flashy, and he said they did not allow the mind to rest. So but he did tend to go to fantasy movies. He saw King Kong, he saw Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and a few other fantasy films. For those who don't know, Lewis was born in Northern Ireland in 1898 and had a very happy childhood. His father was a successful attorney. His mother had a degree in mathematics, which was unusual for that time and place. But his mother died when he was only 9 years old, which is very traumatic for him. His father didn't know what to do with the 2 sons, Clive, or he went by Jack, and his brother Warren. So they went off to boarding school in England. Now, young Jack had never been outside of Ireland, and he not only did they go to England, but they went to a boarding school which was very poorly chosen. The schoolmaster was very brutal and abusive. He was later declared insane. He ended up in an institution. So Lewis had this very strong feeling that his childhood was his personal Eden, but he was cast out of paradise when his mother died. If you read Surprised by Joy, the basis of the narrative is the search for joy, which doesn't just mean happiness. it means this particular kind of longing, which was painful but also pleasurable. And he said when he read Beatrix Potter and had all these pictures of autumn, he had this feeling of longing. Why can't I go be in this book? But it was also pleasurable. When he read some Nordic poetry, he had the same feeling. And sometimes just a particular sound of geese flying overhead going south would create this feeling. And he said, somehow this is important, this feeling of sweet desire or sin-soaked or joy, that seems to be the secret to the meaning of life. This title of this is Most Reluctant Prophet. In many ways, his main reluctance was the most reluctant convert. He was a wounded child because of his mother's death and is being shipped off to English boarding schools. But imaginatively, he had this quest for what is the source of this joy or this Sehnsucht. The Germans call it the blue flower motif. Somehow it always seems on the horizon, there's a paradise that you can see, but you can't enter into it. Chris and I had this experience. We went to school at Westmont in Santa Barbara, which is a beautiful city in Southern California. And we were up in the mountains looking down at the marina, and there was this shining blue ocean and all these cute little sailboats. And we just said, oh, that's got to be paradise. So we were up there where we were. It was kind of dusty, and there were a lot of Jeeps going by throwing up dust, and it was hot. And so we said, let's go down to the marina. So we jumped in my little Volkswagen, drove down to the marina, and it was crowded with tourists, and it had this kind of briny sea smell, and we couldn't find parking. And we looked back at the mountains behind Santa Barbara, and they were so green and peaceful. And we said, oh, if only we could be in the mountains. And that was kind of our personal experience of joy or Sehnsucht. It's always on the horizon, and it's a pleasure to look at it, but it's a frustration not to be able to enter into that beauty. So Lewis spent his life trying to figure out what the source of joy was. For a while, he was just a materialist. His childhood faith faded with his mother's passing. In Northern Ireland, religion was very politicized, and so it was very important. Are you a Protestant or are you a Catholic? And they had different pubs in different neighborhoods, and it was very segregated. There was a lot of antagonism. It often broke into violence. So once he left Ireland, he pretty much associated religion with politics, and it was something he wanted to leave behind. So for a while, he tried materialism. There's no spiritual forces. Everything is just the physical world and the laws of gravity and the other laws of physics. But that wasn't very satisfying to him, because he had a very strong sense that why is there so much injustice? Why is there so much suffering? But then he asked himself, well, where did I get that standard? Why am I judging the world as falling short of my moral standards? Mice don't say, why am I being attacked by a hawk? They don't stop and consider, this isn't fair, you know. But humans say, was this fair? Is this good? Why are you treating me that way? And so his sense of innate moral law kept him looking beyond materialism. And he also felt that when people say, well, our brains are just the development from Darwinian evolution and they're help for survival, when he said, well, how do we know that our thoughts are true? If it's just a survival mechanism, do our thoughts actually correspond to reality? And he started saying, I believe my thoughts do correspond to reality. And I feel that my moral, my conscience or my moral sense corresponds to some moral standard by which we all judge each other. And so he left behind materialism. He spent some time looking at occultism. He thought maybe the theosophists or people who do seances had access to the spiritual world. He had some very bad experiences. His adoptive mother, Mrs. Moore, after the war, he moved in with one of his friends' mothers who had been killed in the war, and they developed a surrogate mother-son relationship. But her brother dabbled in occultism and seances and theosophy, and he had a nervous breakdown in his 40s, and he felt that demons were trying to drag him down to hell. His name was Doc Askins. And Lewis said, well, if there are spiritual forces that are available through occultism, they're dark forces, they're evil forces. And ironically, he believed in spiritual evil or the devil or the demonic before it was clear to him what the other side was, what was good, who were angels, who's God and his benevolent nature. So he went through all these avenues of exploration, trying to find the source of joy, of sweet desire. Where does this inconsolable longing come from? And when he met Tolkien, he got back to Oxford after the war. He served in the war, which only reinforced his pessimism about human nature. He and Tolkien both did. But when they met, they talked about the war. Turned out they both loved fantasy. They both loved George MacDonald. Now, Lewis had heard that the dying God myth appears all over the world. It's not just Jesus on the cross. It's Osiris in Egyptian mythology. It's Balder in Norse mythology. And so he learned from anthropology that the dying God myth wasn't all that unique. But Tolkien said, well, wait a minute, let me reframe that for you. Balder is clearly a mythic figure. Osiris is a mythic figure. Dionysus is a mythic figure. Jesus, it actually says in the time of Augustus, when Quirinius was the governor of Syria, it's very historically located in time and place. So Tolkien said the dying God myth is just an intuition that all people have of a need for redemption. We can't fix ourselves. We can't use self-effort to become the kind of people we want to be. We need some kind of divine power to take us to a level of grace and peacefulness. So Tolkien was very instrumental in Lewis becoming a Christian. He didn't become a Christian until his early 30s, which is about the same time that St. Paul became a Christian and Augustine became a Christian. So those of you who are parents and you're worried about your children who are struggling in their teens or 20s, you never know. This struggle may be very valuable. This may lead them to be very influential Christian thinkers and spokespersons in later years. I was once doing that. Lewis found out that Tolkien had these wonderful stories, The Hobbit, and he was working on The Lord of the Rings. And Tolkien just liked to dabble. He called it his mad hobby. And Lewis said, this is great. This is wonderful. You need to submit it for publication. And so one time I was doing a radio interview and I said, if it wasn't for Tolkien, we might never have heard of Lewis, because he might not have become a Christian, which really ignited his intellect and his imagination. But if it wasn't for Lewis, we might never have heard of Tolkien, because he might never have submitted these stories for publication. So I made that remark, and the interviewer said, yes, if it wasn't for Lewis and Tolkien, we might never have heard of you, which I thought was uncalled for. But in any case, Lewis was a late convert, and part of the reason his apologetics are so powerful is he knew for a long time what it felt like to be an atheist. He knew what it felt like to believe in no God, no goodness, no spiritual forces above the material world we live in. And as he worked through all the other options and critiqued them and eventually rejected them, when he came to Christianity, it struck him with so much force that he spent the rest of his life explaining and amplifying why Christian faith was such a intellectually compelling and emotionally satisfying way to look at the world. People know him as the writer of the Narnia Chronicles, but he became a very famous English professor. He was probably the most well-known professor at Oxford in the 30s and 40s. He also wrote these wonderful apologetic works, Screwtape Letters and Miracles and Mere Christianity. And so Narnia actually came rather late in his career. The thing that people most know him for was, in his mind, it was a bit of an afterthought. He wrote a friend in 1950, well, I've had a good run as an author, but I think I've run out of material. I feel like I just don't please readers the way that I used to. And he wrote that right before the first Narnia Chronicle was published. So he had many talents, but one of them was not as a prophet. He was not a good prophet. So that's a quick overview.
Yeah. No, thank you, David. And as you remind us of today's title, I want to ask you guys one more question before we parse the title. Okay. You keep on setting us up for that, so we're going to be hanging, and that is, for each of you with your respective authors. And it's kind of, I kind of feel bad because I'm sure Crystal has lots to say about Lewis, and I'm sure David has lots to say about Sayers. But for the purposes of today, what has surprised you each most? Maybe the funniest thing, the strangest thing, about as you've done your work on each of your respective people. What's something that's really surprised you about them, or that's something that you just wish everyone knew this story? This is just a great story.
Well, what surprised me when I started studying Sayers, that first time we went to the Wade, and I was a brand new tenure track professor, and looking forward to a sabbatical where I could get a book written. And as I read her letters, I was just so shocked how sharp she could be with people. And I was so, even though she is older than, she's probably the age of my great-grandmother, she would just tell people what she thought about them. And I was so trained that as a Christian woman, you're always gracious and you keep your opinions to yourself. And even to the great C.S. Lewis, she would write and kind of verbally wag her finger at him and start a letter. Dear Professor Lewis, oi, I must really write you another letter. And so I kind of thought, wow, I haven't met a woman like this. And the more I studied her life, I realized at the time in which she lived, she had to be really feisty and strong just to get heard, just to get valued. I mean, here she does all the work and doesn't even get a degree. One of the fun items we have at the Wade Center is, since they didn't give women degrees in 1915, they gave them a certificate that just said, yes, you did all the work. And so we have the signed certificate. So
she did get a degree in 1920. Correct?
Yes.
So,
after World War I, the Great War, I think Oxford realized, in fact, this I quote this from a book that's called Somerville for Women. And of course, Sayers is in that. Sayers went to Somerville College, which was a women's college. And basically, Oxford needed more income after so many of its students were killed in the trenches of the Great War. And so they reversed themselves and started giving degrees. And Sayers was a member of the first cohort in 1920 that were given degrees retroactively. And this started Oxford in a new direction. And Sayers actually got both a BA and MA simultaneously for all the work she had done. And here, before, she just got her little 1915 certificate. Another, what was still though somewhat symbolical, is that when they gave women degrees, they didn't get to wear the hard mortarboards that males at Oxford did. They had soft caps. So still, yes, women are still soft. And then I read Sayers, she's not soft at all. And so I kept being shocked, but I realized it was her ability to shock people that got them to think about their faith in new ways. And because my desire is to draw as many people to Jesus Christ as possible, I started learning from her that you got to get people out of kind of their habitual mental processes. And you do that by using shocking language.
Very cool. Dr. Downing, the other.
What was the question?
Now, do I believe him that he doesn't remember, Crystal, or?
Oh, yeah.
Well, my surprise also had to do with letters. I'd read all of Lewis's published books when we started coming to the Waite Center in the 90s, but they have thousands of unpublished letters. And in these days of text and emails, letters aren't that rich. You normally dig them up to show that a government official has been up to no good. But I was amazed when I read Lewis's unpublished letters, how much thought he would put into a letter to an individual. He felt it was part of his ministry to respond to letters. And they were very witty, but they're very thoughtful. I'm actually hoping to put together a book of Lewis's spiritual advice as a mentor. So I enjoyed reading the letters as much as I enjoyed reading his published books. One person wrote, a lot of women kind of got a crush on him at a distance just because they loved the persona of his books. So one of them wrote to him and said, "Are you handsome?" And he said, "Well, not that I know of," which was a funny answer. Another woman said, "I'm thinking about moving to California for the climate." And Lewis wrote back and said, "I wouldn't move somewhere for the climate unless I were a vegetable." So
and let me insert here. When we moved to Illinois from Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania is gorgeous, just a gorgeous state. And we moved to Illinois. And so we keep telling each other, we are not vegetables. We are not vegetables. We are not vegetables.
Indeed not.
So, but apart from the witty things, he spent a lot of time addressing questions. Someone said, "I've just become a Christian. I'm so excited. I'm so ecstatic. I never realized how happy I would be when I became." And Lewis said, "Well, those feelings you're having, that's actually the birthday present, but that's not the birthday." He said, "Those feelings will fade. And when they do fade, don't feel like you lost your faith or you're somehow lost touch with God. Just realize that your faith is based upon your will. You make a willful commitment to be in relationship with God, which is different from feeling enthusiastic." And he said, when a parent first tries to help a child learn to ride a bike, they'll give them a push when they're first starting out, but then you have to learn how to pedal on your own. And sometimes you're going to come to steep hills and there's nobody there to push you up the hill. And I thought it's such a wonderful analogy, just to one person. Every time I get a good thought, I say, how do I get this published in an article or a book or somewhere? But he has literally a book full of wonderful spiritual insights. And he was only writing to one person. Sometimes he said one day in a letter, "I've been writing personal mail for 9 hours." Many of these he wrote by hand with a dip pen. So I love how Lewis, as we say, he walked his talk. When I was in college, I really got excited about Alan Watts and Robert Heinlein and other figures. But they were such good writers. But when you looked into their personal lives, it was a disaster. They weren't able to live out their worldview, or they could say things very cleverly in writing, but they couldn't really live them out very well. And the more I studied Lewis, I loved how he gave most of his book royalties to charity. I love how he spent a lot of time writing letters to strangers, trying to help them in their spiritual walk. His stepson, Doug Gresham, says that one time a royal pulled up in a Rolls Royce at the Kilns, and Doug won't say who it was. My guess it was Prince Philip, and because he was a real spiritual searcher. And he came in and said, "Could I talk to Mr. Lewis? I read your books." And they talked for 2 hours. And after he left, Doug said, "Well, why did you spend 2 hours talking to this guy?" And Lewis said, "Well, I was hoping I could help him." So he had this humble spirit of service and mentoring that really fits with his writing. So I love the fact that he really integrated his own personal life into the view of Christian faith, which he projects in his books.
Yeah. May that become less and less rare, not the least amongst those who study the works of Lewis and Sayers.
Right.
That title, let's parse the title. Reluctant Prophet. Should there be a question mark at the end of that title? Or is that a statement? Is it interrogative or a statement?
For me, there's not a question mark, because Sayers wrote a series of radio plays, and we can talk about this later, for BBC Radio. And people were telling her, like the producer of the radio plays wrote her and said, "You are a prophet." And she wrote back and said, "I am not a prophet. I am just making clear Christian orthodoxy. It's just that I'm using language that people aren't familiar with." So she fought that term quite explicitly, prophet. Some people would write and say, "Oh, I love how your faith is so distinctive and it's inspiring to the rest of us." And she goes, "There's nothing distinctive about my faith. I am just delivering Christian orthodoxy, but in language you're not familiar with." So she didn't want to be considered doing something different. What was different was her language. The truth doesn't change, but in order to reach more people, our language does need to change. Now, why don't you take the reluctant prophet?
Well, I wrote a book called, excuse me, I'm sorry, The Most Reluctant Convert, because Lewis was in no hurry to become a Christian. As I said, he spent most of his teens and 20s as an atheist. But when he did realize that Christianity was true, he said that first, he had an idea of human personality that was sort of like concentric circles, that your imagination is the outside circle and your intellect is the middle circle, and then the center is your will. So he felt that when he read George MacDonald's Fantasties as a teenager, his imagination was baptized. He could suddenly see the beauty of Christian faith, and he could suddenly have a sense that maybe there is a benevolent intelligence behind the universe. But he carried that imaginatively for many years. It wasn't until he met Tolkien and Neville Coghill and other really brilliant Christians at Oxford that he said Christianity is intellectually plausible, but the final step is to surrender your will. If you give in to a certain philosophy, it doesn't have something like pantheism. You don't have to do anything. There's just this life force that is in all things in the universe, but you don't have to surrender to it. You don't have to seek its will. And so Lewis was reluctant because he liked being captain of his own soul. He didn't like the idea that if I become a Christian, then I have marching orders. I have to change my life. I have to spend my time differently. So he was a very reluctant convert. That phrase comes from Surprised by Joy. He didn't go out of his way to be a prophet. He wrote a book called Pilgrim's Regress, which is an updated version of Pilgrim's Progress, in which he explained his own spiritual journey. And he makes fun of modernists and Freudians and a lot of other fads from the 1920s. But he was actually asked to write The Problem of Pain about evil and suffering and injustice. And so he didn't seek out that book. He starts out the book by saying, when it comes to pain, a little insight or a little endurance is better than insight, and the least tincture of the love of God is better than intellectual explanations. So he really realized that if you are in touch with God and drawing upon his grace and his power, that gives you kind of endurance and resilience in the midst of suffering that you may not get under your own emotional strength. So someone saw The Problem of Pain and said, "Oh, can you do some radio talks during World War II about Christian faith?" The BBC, actually part of its charter was to have some religious programming built in. Now, he started out, his first session of Mere Christianity was called The Key to the Right and Wrong is the Key to the Universe. And he was talking about this moral law. If somebody takes your seat on the bus or if somebody steals your bicycle, you immediately feel like, wait a minute, there's a moral law and you've broken it. And we all tend to acknowledge that. Now, his first episode of the broadcast talks was, before it was the news in Norwegian, which the BBC was broadcasting to those in Norway who'd been conquered by the Nazis. And afterwards was Welsh folk singing. So he did not get a prime slot, but he was such an articulate spokesman and he had a great voice for radio. He sounds like a little bit like Winston Churchill, a little bit like Alfred Hitchcock. And so it got more and more momentum, and he started getting thousands of letters. And so they asked him to add an extra session to the first one, and then they asked him to do 3 more series. That became Mere Christianity. And if you look at it, there's 4 parts, which were 4 different series of radio talks. So he didn't really set out to become a spokesman of Christianity. He was invited to speak about his faith, and he was happy to do so. But I don't know if I'd say reluctant. I'd say almost kind of an accidental prophet. People came to him and asked for his ideas, and he was so effective in articulating his faith that he got more and more invitations. He spoke during the war. He traveled all over England by train to speak to RAF personnel. And once again, he was kind of a homebody. He liked to just stay at home and see his friends in the pub and read books. But he really felt it was part of his duty to communicate faith. So he went all over England, and the tour was kind of a failure because he never really tried to be an apologist before. When he would use the word creature, meaning we're all created by God, the audience would think of animals. They would think of all creatures, great and small. So he'd say we're all creatures of God, and people would go, well, I'm not a dog. I'm not a... he also learned that they had very little conviction of personal sin. They felt that evil, according to the Marxists, you have all these repressed feelings that you are kind of leaking out. Excuse me, according to the Freudians. According to the Marxists, it's a class struggle. It's the capitalists who are oppressing the workers. And he was really struck by how few of his viewers or his listeners had a sense of personal failure, that I'm not the best version of myself. There's a lot of selfishness and pride that are making me a less fulfilled human being. But it's an interesting thing because his tour of the RAF bases was basically a failure. He said he felt like Balaam's ass. He was just kind of bleeding, but not really getting through. But that prepared him for doing the broadcast talks, because now he knew who was out there in his audience, and he knew what they needed to hear. So fascinatingly, he became a prophet. I would say he backed into the role. And he was just so good at articulating his Christian faith, he got more and more invitations. They wanted to do more BBC series, but he said, no, I'm finished. They wanted more Narnia Chronicles. He was that lucky author where people always say, we want more, we want more. And he said, well, it's best to quit when they want more rather than to keep writing until they go, please, no more. We don't need more from you. I can name a few contemporary authors where I just go, just retire, go to Tahiti. We don't need any more books from you. But Lewis was not that way. He always wanted people to continue to express himself about his faith and his imagination and his view of fantasy worlds.
I'd like to go back and give more about the reluctance of Sayers as a prophet. So I talked about when people called her a prophet after they evidently thought she was a prophet, and she renounced that. But she had somewhat of a different faith journey than C.S. Lewis did. She was the daughter of a rector. But in England in the 1890s, that's a prestigious job. You know, they lived in this gorgeous mansion. She was an only child, huge mansion on acres of land because of the prestige of what you get an Oxford degree, and then you can become a rector. So her father was also a Freemason. So it's like Freemasonry, Christianity, you know, those are both about mysteries. And when Sayers went off to Oxford, she compartmentalized her Christianity. She never renounced it because she knew it would hurt her parents so much. She was so glad that her college didn't require going to chapel. When you read her letters, she writes home. She never writes home for spiritual advice. She writes home for cigarettes. And after I left off when I talked about her wanting to write screenplays, and she met a producer and she wrote several screenplays, but she was doing it right after France, its film industry, because really film became an art form in France, but the Great War destabilized that, and Hollywood was starting to get really big. so she wasn't able to get any of her screenplays produced. And she basically started writing detective fiction because she needed the money. She wrote home and said, I hear there's a lot of money in detective fiction. And so sure enough, she made a lot of money in detective fiction, although she was also working for 9 years for an advertising agency. So while she was starting her writing, and it was working for an advertising agency where she realized if you're going to get attention, you got to shock people, right? You got to appeal to their contemporary desires. And that prepared her. And I see, just as I've talked about God leading us in different directions, I see God leading Sayers. And because she was this best-selling detective fiction novelist, the Friends of Canterbury Cathedral reached out to her and said, we would like you to do a play that can be performed in Canterbury Cathedral about the history of Christianity, and especially Canterbury Cathedral. Now, the person who did it 2 years before her was the great T.S. Eliot, Murder in the Cathedral. You know, and so she was—
Which I think would be a great title for a detective story. Murder.
It would.
Oh, I know, that's true. Maybe that's what made them think about Dorothy Sayers. But anyway, this wasn't her interest. She was a detective fiction writer, and she was very reluctant about doing this. And she held back and finally decided, okay, I can go ahead and do this, even though I'm just a popularizer, versus T.S. Eliot is this, you know, great modernist poet. And she wrote a play called The Zeal of Thy House about an architect who rebuilt part of, and architect and stonemason rebuilt part of Canterbury Cathedral after it was burned down in the 12th century. And so her main character, she identified with, in that he knew he wasn't a great artist, he was a craftsman. And that's how Sayers thought of herself. Well, in our era, nobody respects detective fiction, and modernist thinkers looked down on anything that was a bestseller because that means it appeals to the masses. It's not like the great T.S. Eliot who writes poems nobody can understand. And so she took one thing she was passionate about, and she hadn't been expressing any passion for Christianity really in her letters, but what she was passionate about was the integrity of the work. And in fact, she was getting sick and tired of detective fiction, sick and tired of Lord Peter Wimsey, her famous amateur detective. And there's this great story where in 1930, she was so sick and tired of Peter Wimsey, his insufferable breeziness, that she wrote one novel that doesn't even have Peter Wimsey in it. She wanted to get rid of him. And then another novel that was published in 1930, where she invented a woman that she's going to marry Lord Peter Wimsey off to. But because she's committed to the integrity of her work, she created this interesting woman who, wow, coincidentally enough, was a detective fiction writer who was being tried for the murder of her live-in lover. You know, and wow, this is 1930. You know, this woman living without benefit of marriage with a man. I mean, this was a marginal woman. And she has Lord Peter fall in love with her. But then Sayers put so much time thinking about this character, Harriet Vane, her commitment to the integrity of work, that she decided, after she wrote this novel called Strong Poison, she goes, I can't marry this woman off to Lord Peter. He's a twit. How can I do that to her? And so she had to write several more detective novels over the next 5 years that changed Lord Peter to make him worthy of this character she invented, Harriet Vane. Okay, so integrity of work. Then she creates this architect in the play for Canterbury Cathedral. and he's totally committed to the integrity of his work. But like Harriet Vane, he's having sexual dalliances on the side. And I won't summarize the plot, but what Sayers felt she had to do is to think about what is the relationship of the integrity of work to Christian theology. And most Oxford graduates, they've studied the Bible, they've studied theology. It's just part of the traditional, at that time, the traditional curriculum. So she knew her theology, but she came up with this original idea that creativity fulfills the Imago Dei. You know, we're told in Genesis 1:27 that both male and female are created in the image of God. But you look at Genesis 1, how is God described in Genesis 1? God isn't a judge, God isn't a redeemer, God isn't a lawgiver. God, the God of Genesis 1, is a creator. And then, so in that same chapter, if we're created in the image of God, that must mean creativity is how we fulfill the image of God, or in Latin, create Imago Dei. And people, and she suggested this at the end of the play, that our creativity is Trinitarian, just like the Christian God is. And she says, every artist recognizes you have idea, which is like God the Father, you have energy, like it is Christ the Son, the incarnation. It's just like writers today still say, yeah, I had this idea, but when I started fleshing it out, I started incarnating my idea, but the fleshing out and the idea are still one. They're consubstantial. And the fleshing out of the idea then has power as the author reads what is being expressed. And so that's like the Holy Spirit given in Pentecost, the power of Pentecost. And she didn't use in the play the concept of writing a book, but she just had this angel explain creativity as idea and energy and power. So theologians read the play. It was very popular because it kind of had the little woo, the architect is having an affair with this widow. And so it was spicy, but really theologically solid. So it was popular. It went to the West End in England, in London, excuse me. Yes. And so theologians saw it. They wrote her and said, you've got to expand this idea of yours. And after this Canterbury play, she just stopped writing detective fiction because so many people were they were just shocked. The great creator of Lord Peter Wimsey is a Christian? You're kidding me. And she was speaking more and more about theological topics. People were asking her to write more and more about it. So she was reluctant to become a Christian apologist. And then the more she wrote, the people were calling her a prophet. And she, as I said before, didn't want that. But God works in mysterious ways.
Indeed, and amen. Thank goodness we don't know where we're going to end up. But you've done a great job, both of you, at showing how both of our writers are kind of edgy, but they also have a passion for tradition. They both have rather unconventional lives. They both love film, or felt different ways of approaching that, perhaps. But they were both doggedly ecumenical. We haven't really dipped into that, but that marks both of them. They're doggedly ecumenical. So tell us a little bit about how they met and what happened, what sparked. Were they kindred spirits? What way were they not kindred spirits? Tell us a little bit about their relationship.
Well, obviously, Lewis was ecumenical because growing up in Northern Ireland, everything was so denominational. And being a Protestant or being a Catholic were almost like two different religions. And his mother was very ecumenical. She was a very gentle spirit, and she would hire Catholic workers and had Catholic friends, which is very unusual for that time. Many people at the turn of the century, Warren said that he never met a Catholic until he went off to military school at Sandhurst. His entire childhood was surrounded by Protestants. So when Lewis came back to faith, he wanted it to be mere Christianity. He didn't want it to be a denomination. And so he stressed what are the basic doctrines that we all agree on from the early Christian councils, the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. And he actually showed mere Christianity to a Baptist and a Methodist and an Anglican and a Catholic and said, does this sound like a fair presentation of the Christian faith? So I think a lot of his ecumenicism came from wanting to be like his mother and say, all Christians in a world of unbelievers and people who are antagonistic to faith, Christians really should stress their similarities rather than their differences. And he had a number of Catholic friends there in England. As a matter of fact, some of the Inklings, Tolkien was a Catholic. Now, Tolkien always thought that Lewis was more Protestant than he realized. The north of Ireland is called Ulster. That's the Protestant part of Ireland. And Tolkien said, well, he tries to be a mere Christian, but sometimes I can sense a kind of ulterior motive in his writings. Tolkien always wished that he would have gone all the way and become a Roman Catholic rather than just an Anglican. But yes, they were both very committed to Christians stressing their agreements rather than their disagreements. Tolkien said, Lewis said, one of the things that I disagree on with Catholics is the seriousness of our disagreements. Lewis thought that what everybody shared was much more important than things they differed about.
During World War II, in 1941, Sayers had developed this passion. Now, the play that transformed her life, that was 1936. She wrote it. It was performed 37. And by 1941, she had published a book called The Mind of the Maker, which expanded, yay, on her idea of creativity as Trinitarian. And she was asked to write a series of radio plays. And what was the question again?
Ecumenicism.
Oh, yeah. Also,
bringing you guys back to Lewis and Sayers.
So complicated, and because I haven't even talked about how Dorothy Sayers caused the biggest religious scandal in 20th century England. But we'll get back to that. In 1941, then, Sayers started thinking about the need for ecumenism. And what really generated this is her reading a book by an Eastern Orthodox theologian called Nicholas Zhernov. And she just loved this book. And she wrote a letter to someone saying, after I read this book, and it's called, let's see, what is its title? Church of the Eastern Christians. She wrote someone and she said, I was just going to go out and convert to Eastern Orthodoxy right away. She just so enjoyed it. And it turns out it was consonant with what happened to her when she wrote the Canterbury play, The Zeal of Thy House, insofar as seeing creativity as the importance of this, the relational aspect of creativity, just as God is relational, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. Creativity is relational, but that relationship for God precedes being. And I think she was attracted then to Eastern Orthodoxy. And this is one of my theories that I put in my first book about Sayers. There is a theologian named Catherine Mowry LaCugna, who in the 1990s, by reading her book, she explained, and I assume this is accurate, that for the Eastern Orthodox Church, relationship precedes being. So the communality, the communion within God's own character identifies God. Whereas LaCugna says that in the Western Church, being precedes communion. So the Western Church emphasizes more your individuality. I think that was picked up in the Protestant Reformation, that you make, I mean, I grew up learning about a personal relationship with Jesus, even though that phrase appears nowhere in Scripture. It's about me as an individual making a commitment to God. And I think Sayers, she, after even reading Zhernoff about the Eastern Church, she started calling herself an Anglo-Catholic, in that she recognized there was something valuable about the community of the Mass itself, that you are together celebrating with other Christians, rather than this autonomous, and kind of the way David and I both grew up. You know, it's you and me, Jesus. As long as I ask Jesus into my heart, case closed. I don't have to, worry about anything else. I've got my ticket to heaven. And so the community within God's character, which is essential to her understanding of creativity, then made her want to encourage conversation among different Christian traditions. And she actually, and she called it, rather than the lowest common denominator that we have, she wanted to talk about the highest common factor rather than lowest, highest. She drew together theologians from the Eastern Orthodox, the Roman Catholic, the High Church Protestant, and Low Church Protestant, to try to agree on what do we share together. And both Sayers and Lewis felt like the essentials that we all share as Christians is doctrine established at the first 4 ecumenical councils.